Welcome to the Face to Face podcast, your go to resource for living a life of vitality, wholeness, and authenticity. I am one of your hosts, Melinda Wilson.
And I'm your other host, Kathy Little. Join us as we explore deeper connection, lasting freedom, and meaningful relationships with God, others, and your true self. Let's dive in.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Episode 175. We've got part 2 with Chris Green. He's actually a bishop. And if you want to know what that means, go look it up on Wikipedia.
We're so excited. The first part of this was really good, and it just kept getting better. So we're excited to share part 2 with you. And just a couple quick things. We have the Understanding Trauma course. You can get that at emmanuelinstitute.com under courses. That's a standalone course. You can take it on its own. Major voices in trauma and trauma-informed care coming together in one place. So we're excited about that.
Yeah, and one thing about that, y'all, is, you can go on YouTube and find a free video on understanding trauma. But what this course is, it's a compilation that actually took a long time to put together of the best in one place. And it takes you through, and you can do step-by-step, those of you who like to do like a check mark. This is the place. Comprehensive, but very digestible course on understanding trauma. I highly encourage you to go over there and get it.
Yeah, and then we are adding a level 1 for those of you that are interested in that in January, February, and then also one in March, April. So we'll be getting you details on that as we move forward. But for now, we want to jump right back in to Chris Green. So buckle up.
Thanks for listening.
Chris, do you think that one's view of God would impact their ability to operate out of tenderness?
Absolutely. Especially if we can get, again, I assume everyone kind of has two theologies. What I was earlier kind of loosely calling their kind of head theology and their heart theology. And I don't want to overplay that difference, but I do think if you ask people, tell me what you think of God, I think most of the time what's going to come out of them first is not quite the whole truth. They're going to tell you what they think they're supposed to say. But if you can push past that to what they actually think, yes, I do think that that is already a place of tenderness. And the key is how to get there in ways that free them up to speak. And so I don't think that getting the right ideas into people's heads about God is enough, right? You can't simply say, repeat these statements about God and now you've got it. But we do have to say, so whether that's something like God is holy or God is good or God is eternal, whatever our statements are about God, I think it matters what we say, but we have to do more than just get the formulas right. We have to somehow talk about what that means so that the seed of that goes down into the soil of the heart. And that's long, slow work. But that will absolutely affect the way that they live and pray.
Well, I feel like what you were saying about growth, we were talking a little bit about this with Chuck DeGroat yesterday about this faux vulnerability that we see online with leaders, pastors, teachers, the people that are, buy my coaching package and do this and you'll have all this transformation. And they seem vulnerable and seem real, but you're right. There's this desire for it to be easy. I know growth is terribly painful, honestly, in my own experience. And you can't really grow without change, and you can't change without growth. But I was thinking as you were talking about tenderness, the difference between tenderness and vulnerability. And I would love to get your thoughts on this because I see or maybe experience or view vulnerability as something I am outwardly to others, or I am in a place of vulnerability. I'm vulnerable to share. But tenderness, then, the way you're describing it, seems to me something that I would be tender toward somebody.
Hmm.
And where
Hmm.
vulnerability seems to be something within me that is about me,
Hmm.
as far as I feel vulnerable or I'm being vulnerable in this group and really sharing my heart.
Yeah.
Whereas tenderness is like you're describing God as tender toward us or tender toward our weaknesses. Can you
This is a
help just
really, yeah,
differentiate that a little bit?
this is a really helpful observation, Melinda. I think I want to be so careful here because I don't want to be misheard, but I do think there's a way in which vulnerability can turn us in on ourselves. And I think this is what you're observing, that I can obsess over my wounds. I can feed on my own grief. I can turn my suffering into display and try to make a connection with you by convincing you to look with me at my wounds. And in our kind of cultural moment, because of what social media has made possible, that's very tempting. That's very tempting, especially for people who feel isolated. And many
Mm,
ministers are isolated by their office. They're isolated, and so you can establish faux connections through faux vulnerabilities, and that ultimately are really self-occupied, self-preoccupied.
mm,
And to me, and again, I don't mean at all to suggest that there aren't times in which we do need to show our wounds to other people and to have consolation and even people who will just sit with us. I mean, we've all heard this many times, but we've heard it because it's true. You know, Job needed his friends to come and sit with him and grieve with him, and for them to see what he was suffering and to suffer it with him. And at first they were good friends because they did that. They came and sat with him and saw what he was suffering. So I don't mean at all suggest we should never talk about our pains or invite others to see our wounds. But I think tenderness, you're right, is not about you seeing how I'm hurt, but me being present to you in ways that are sensitive to
mm,
what's true for you. So it's anything but self preoccupied. It's relational. It's in touch. And I think that's where our humanity is most fully alive. And paradoxically, you're most likely to see me for who I am, not when I'm asking you, look at my wounds, but when I'm hearing you, when I'm attending to you. So when I go out of myself to someone else, as I'm going out of myself, forgetting myself, like just fully present to the other person, I actually become most fully myself and therefore can
mm,
kind of be seen for who I am. So, ironically and paradoxically, when I'm trying to get you to see me, I'm too turned in on myself to really be seen for who I am. So, I think in our kind of therapeutic culture, we can very easily become preoccupied with our own hurts and think that the way to establish connection with other people is to say, hey, look at how I'm hurt. But really, that can't be a way of life. There are moments in which you have to do that, but you can't live like that. You have to let all of that make you tender toward them and not in a way that draws attention back to yourself. I mean, I've made this mistake so many times. You're talking with someone, they're sharing a way in which they're hurting, and the instinct is to say, "Oh, I've hurt in that same way." And by bringing that up, you think
mhm,
you're establishing connection, but much of the time, what you're doing is turning attention away from them back to yourself, right? So I think the key is yes, you want to bring your experiences to those conversations, but you don't have to name it. You can let your experience move you toward that person, make you more tender toward them without oversharing what is happening with you.
mhm,
I think one more thing to name here. Dietrich Bonhoeffer makes this point about pastoral care, that it's really important that the pastor never expose himself or herself when caring for others.
mm,
And reading him, I read it first years and years ago. I didn't know what to make of it at the time, but now looking back, I realize what he's saying. That in moments where you're trying to help someone who's in a lot of pain, there is a temptation to overshare in order to normalize their experience.
Mm,
To try to say to them, "Oh, I know what you're going through. This happened to me." But what they need in those moments, most of the time, is not to know you've gone through it too, but that God is with them in what they're suffering. They don't
mhm.
need attention brought back to you. They need attention brought to the way in which God is present to them. And so I think it takes a lot of discipline and maturity to kind of recognize, okay, this is similar to what's happened to me, but I don't need to bring my story in full right now. Most of the time, it can just be, all right, I can be present to what's happening with them. So I think you've really put your finger on something critically important.
You talk, can I just do a PS to that, Kathy? I don't want to, you mentioned suffering a couple times, and that is something that I think any human being on the face of the earth
Yes.
has asked a question along the lines of why does God, if God is loving, why does God allow suffering?
Yes.
And I would love for you to share how you understand the role of suffering in the Christian life or just in life in general.
Yes. So this is going to be counterintuitive for a lot of people and maybe just controversial for some, but I actually think we've created a problem for ourselves with our privilege and the comfort of modern life. And that is we tend to think that only some of what we're experiencing is suffering, and we can't figure out why any of that suffering is there. But for most of human history in most places of the world, and most places in the world right now, life is so full of suffering, they don't isolate different parts of their lives as problematic. God, why are you allowing this suffering to happen?
Mm,
Because life is hard on every front.
mm,
And it's a mark of our privilege and a mark of our the kind of comfort we've lived in for the last few generations that we start to think, why would God let this suffering happen? Now, don't misunderstand me. Obviously, scripture is full of lament and protest. I mean, there are more lament psalms than there are psalms of praise, right? So it's not a new experience. God, why would you let these calamities come? Why would you allow these disasters to fall on us? I mean, think of the story of Job. But I think most of us, again, by us, I mean the people who are living kind of conventional American lives, we tend to think of suffering as something we could eliminate if we just figured out the right approach to it. If we find the right doctors or the right gurus or the right medicine or the right, training regimen, like we can just kind of get all of this out. And I think human life is suffering from A to Z. To be a human is to be at the mercy of things. We're all born. Don't make a choice to be born. We don't make a choice to be born to these people at this time. We're born into a world we have no say over how it works, and we die. And in in the New Testament, the language of suffering is just it's closer to what we mean by passivity. Like to be human is to be passive in the sense that you are acted upon more than you act. So yes, you have agency, but you have a constrained agency. Most of what's true about you or about me isn't because of my choice. I have choices, but my choices are very limited compared to the givens of my reality. And in that sense, all of life is suffering. All of life is kind of given to you. You're thrown into life. You're thrown into life toward death. You're thrown into a world you didn't make, you didn't choose, as a person that is constituted by forces you're not controlling. And whatever freedom you have is within those constraints, which are severe. And I think sometimes when people are asking about suffering, they're really asking about meaningless suffering on a large scale. They're asking about the Holocaust. They're asking about you know, the earthquakes that kill hundreds and thousands of people or tsunamis. They're asking about hell. But I think we can't get to those questions until we've grappled with, to be human is to be a sufferer. And the question then is, how is God's goodness and faithfulness shown in that? And only once we've started to grapple with those questions can we come to those other larger ones, like how could God let these horrific injustices happen? And I do think there are good, meaningful responses to those questions, but I don't think we can rush to them because very often we we end up explaining away. We give answers that seem to satisfy in the moment, but they don't actually work for how we live. And I think I'm not avoiding your question, but I think we kind of have to start. We have to step back and start in a bigger frame to really get answers that are anything like adequate.
Yeah, that's huge. And it that gives a very helpful perspective of it really gives that light that statement of we have no control over anything except our reaction or response to whatever is happening to us.
Yes,
And that's really an interesting and fascinating way of looking at it where someone in a third world country where there literally is a dire situation 24/7, there is no separation of here's the thing I'm suffering from and then here's a great day over here.
absolutely.
And so life being kind of not from a victim mentality of life is suffering all the time, some
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
dire despairing person. But I think that when you can look at it from that perspective, that it literally is part of life and you can't avoid it, like you're saying. And yet we
Absolutely.
want to because we don't want to feel pain and we don't want to hurt,
I,
whether it's
I,
physical or emotional or whatever.
absolutely. And I think there's a way in which the conventional American life I'm talking about is addicted to success, to efficiency, and to painlessness. I think that the epidemic of painkillers and the abuse of painkillers is a sign of a, a kind of deeper sickness in us, that we are afraid of all pain. We assume that all pain is bad pain, and that all suffering is a is and should be eliminated, could be and should be eliminated if we just knew how to eliminate it. And I don't think that's true. Now I do think there's suffering that's only in the world because of sin, and that suffering needs to be alleviated as much as it can and healed. The harm done by that suffering needs to be healed. But I think that much of life is difficult and even painful by design. That it's not it's not a failure of anyone's part, even God's. It's actually what we were made for, and we're maladjusted to it because of the kinds of lives we've been called to live. And I think it creates anxiety. If I can go out on a limb here, I think that most of the anxiety that eats us up is the anxiety that comes from thinking we have more control than we actually do, and then feeling the pressure to control things that we actually can't control. And our bodies and our deep hearts know that that's not true. And so we're spending all of this energy trying to get mastery over things that are not meant to be mastered. They're not meant to be controlled. And and that puts us ill at ease with ourselves. You know, I could give lots of examples. I'll give one just for the sake of clarity. I learned this really painfully with my children. We had to make a move when our two oldest were pretty young still. They're 20 and 17 now, but this is when they were little kids. And I was trying to be a good dad and include them in the process because I knew that the move was going to be disruptive for them, and they were undergoing it too. Like they were suffering the move. And so I set them down and I talked with them, and we made the move. And several months after the move, my son, who was younger, and at the time was, I think, 5 or 6, maybe 7, but very young. He said one night to us something about how he hated the decision he had made for us to move. And I realized that I was trying to include him in the process, but what I'd actually done is make him feel that it was a choice he had to make. And now that it was difficult for him, he was having difficulty at school, connecting with friends, and the classes were hard. He thought he had brought our family there. And the weight that was on him because of that, it's heartbreaking even now to think about that. I thought I was, helping him by including him, but actually I was burdening him. I was putting a responsibility on him he didn't have the capacity to bear. And I think a lot of us live in that kind of state. We feel a responsibility to control things that we're not actually in control of. And because of that, we're overwhelmed in the way that, that little boy was overwhelmed. And some of what the reason we feel that is that we're so privileged. We have a say over things most human beings have never had a say over. We can control things about our bodies, about our environments, about our food that most, for however many tens of thousands of years there have been human beings on this planet, they developed the wisdom for dealing with for coping with the fact that they had very little control. And for the last 50 years, we human beings in the quote unquote developed world now suddenly have say over things that just was never possible. And we don't have the wisdom for how to live yet. We haven't learned the wisdom for how to live with that much choice. So we have too many options, and we get the illusion of control over things that we actually can't control. So we kind of have to relearn our mortality, our finitude, our fragility, our powerlessness, our weakness, and this is what I was saying earlier about the need for wisdom. We need people who are wise, who live like that, to show us, no, 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 actually, this is the way you want to live. And that means leaning into your weakness, leaning into your powerlessness, leaning into how little control you actually have over things, because paradoxically, that's where your real agency is. When you stop trying to control things you can't control, you come in touch with, oh, but I do have a say about this. I actually can determine how this is going to affect me, how I'm going to respond to it. And that's incredibly empowering. So when you have too many choices and a false sense of control, you're disempowered. It's re-empowering to give up your attempts to control things that aren't yours to control, because you come back to the truth of, oh, wait, I do have say here.
Mm. You're talking about how we as a society run from pain. We don't want to hurt. And even, I'm of the generation where we didn't wear helmets and elbow pads and have seat belts and all that stuff. And dating myself here, but it's interesting how much has been developed to mitigate as much as possible any discomfort
Yes.
at all, period. And it's interesting what you say. It's about not avoiding that or realizing that it's like we try to prevent it at all costs, but realizing that that's actually part of the human experience. And the goal would be, I think I heard you say this, that the goal would be experiencing God with you in it
Yes.
and learning how to connect, which is the Emmanuel approach, which is what we train people in, is that
Mm-hmm.
connection interactively with Jesus. The Emmanuel Institute that we run, it's all about that, learning how to invite people into that interactive connection with Jesus inside the trauma, inside the pain, inside the discomfort,
Right.
and to realize that that's really that's where you find the anchor. But then, you have to, what we see all the time is very much helping people find a Christological lens for God, because they're experiencing Jesus in those moments as God in the
Yes.
flesh. And then that's informing theology and actually unraveling some things about God because of what they're experiencing with him in the painful places where they may have expected him to be mad at them or more judgmental or more retributive or whatever, and they're seeing
Mm-hmm.
compassion and kindness. So now we have a new lens to view God by an experiential encounter with
Yes,
Jesus in the hurt and even in the good times. Like I love seeing people experience Jesus in a way they never knew possible, even in a positive, joy-filled moment,
absolutely.
because they didn't even know it was possible. But here we have Jesus who wants to meet with us and be with us and show us where he is in those places. And the issue has been our lack of awareness that he actually could be there.
Absolutely.
Like even people who say, you know, I'm seeing Jesus in this moment, but I hadn't prayed the prayer yet. I didn't know him then, but there he is, and you can't deny their experience of him in a place where they didn't even expect him to be. So it's redefining how they view God by those encounters. Like you said, you can say you believe this about God, but when it comes into a place where the rubber meets the road, is he going to show up for you the way you need him to? Yes, he's
Mhm.
there. And will you even be able to see him there and interact with him and allow him into those places? Because sometimes our view of God keeps him at arm's length as well, because we don't trust him to be safe. I mean, that's
Yes.
my story too.
Yeah, many, many stories, no doubt. I love all of that, Kathy. I think there's so much I want to say. I'll name two and limit myself to that for the sake of time. But one is so many people who experience that find that their healing can be isolating in a way different from how their pain was isolating. Because as they're healing and as they're finding, oh, God is better than I thought he was, the people they live with can't accept that way of talking about God because it feels
Hmm.
unorthodox or heretical, whatever. And what I've learned over the years is that actually, if people are experiencing true healing, all truth is God's truth. And Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that mostly what's happening in those moments is people are experiencing a truth. They just don't have enough knowledge of Christian faith and practice to connect what they've learned about Jesus to what the church has said about him. And one of the services of
Right.
theology would be to say, no, 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 when you say that, you're actually sounding like this person from 1,000 years ago on the other side of the world who had this to say. And that kind of work is an anchoring, it's a gift because it helps us anchor our personal experience in the church's larger story, which is, I think, really important because you can be just as isolated in your healing as you are in your pain. And we don't want that. So one of the reasons we need theologians who know what they're talking about is to help us say, no, 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 I hear what you're saying, and that sounds like this saint, and this saint is recognized by everyone as someone trustworthy. So you've come to that same Jesus, right? And all of a sudden, this doesn't feel like, some quacky, wacko experience that puts you out by yourself. It actually is grounding you in the larger story. And I think that's really important work.
Hmm.
Then but that requires knowing your history, knowing who the saints are and what the church has said. The other thing is, I think, and I know the two of you will have experienced this over and over again, but there is a kind of grace for the people who are actually suffering the trauma that isn't there for people who are observing it and are troubled by it. So much of the time, our questions about why would God allow suffering are coming from an observer's position. So one of the things that modern life has done to us, and social media has exacerbated this dramatically, is it puts us most of the time in the position of an observer of lived experience. Now, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not against. I mean, I have my iPhone right here. I'm not on social media because I couldn't survive that. But I do have a Substack, so I'm not opposed to all that. But I am leery of a kind of life in which I'm mostly in a mode of observing other people's experiences because I don't think that's a natural human posture. I think we're meant to share life, not to observe one another's lives with a kind of objective distance. And when you're in that mode of kind of observing things, we watch television, we're observing reality play out. We're observing what's playing out on Instagram or TikTok or whatever else. I think that's an inhuman posture. You can't live in that posture. And when you get stuck in it, you end up with problems for which there are no answers, right? Because you're outside of the reality where God is actually working. So if I'm your friend and I'm walking through a deep pain with you, there is grace for me there. But if I'm watching from an objective distance, you suffer pain. There is no grace for me there because that's not a real posture. So I end up with these questions about suffering that are abstract and so unanswerable. I think that's another aspect of this problem that's really, it's hard to name, but it's important to see.
Well, I think too that that's where you're kind of naming without naming the people who react so grossly and with much vitriol over some celebrity's post, or someone writes something about anything from a shoe brand to a weight loss product, and you have people
Yes.
commenting these hatred filled remarks that are like, what is that about, and don't you have something better to do with your life? and
Yes.
i and I think that I think that that could open up a whole other conversation of why do people like watching horror movies or any of those gross drama, crime dramas where you're just watching horrible suffering, because we can sit back and watch it and think we're not being affected by it, but I think everything affects us. And we're not, our brains aren't even neurologically created to bring in all the content that we're
That's right.
observing. I mean, it's
That's
actually
right.
bad for us. I don't
Yes.
need to know what's going on in every single country on the whole entire planet and call it I'm informed
That's
and
it.
I'm a global citizen. But then it's too much and it's crushing. And you're right, Chris. It's just then watching from a distance, and then it causes us to feel angry or helpless or powerless. And now I'm thinking about the terrible story that happened in, Tibet, that I can't do anything about, and I will never be there
That's
to share in their sufferings like you're talking about. Yet it feels like I'm sharing in their suffering because I'm watching the news story and I feel really mad.
right.
But but it's really not actually co-suffering with them at all. And it does disempower us too. And I know we need to kind of wrap up because it's you've got to get to a class, but and
We
happy
both
birthday.
do.
I want to say this to our listeners. This guy took time out of his birthday. I know it's not, to me it'd be like, no, I'm not doing the podcast on my birthday. I want to go celebrate. But happy birthday on
Thank
this
you.
September
Yeah.
24th, Chris. But what could you give us some, maybe some, you're a priest, you're a pastor, you're a teacher. Give us some benediction or closing remarks that we can wrap this up with, Chris. What's on your
Yeah.
heart?
So I think I'll do this. My daughter and I, she's 20 now. She's a senior at the University of Oklahoma, and she's taking a class right now on mystics in Jewish, Christian, Muslim tradition. I think that's the title of the course. I'm sure I got that wrong, but that's the theme of the class. And she was sharing with me the other day this kind of astounding story about Sufi mystics. And I'll get some of these details wrong, but the gist of it was there are these two figures. One of them said of God, I never knew him as I should. I never knew God as I should. And the other one said, I am so full of God, I am God. So the story was about how could both of these mystics be right? How could it be that one of them is saying, I've never known what I should know, and the other one is saying, I'm full of God to the point that you could call me God? And the observation, the wisdom of the story was the first prophet was a sea that is never full. The second prophet was a cup
Mm.
that was filled up and overflowing, saturated. And that it was because they were made different that they experience fullness differently.
Wow.
Mm. Mm.
And so out of that conversation with my daughter, I stumbled into this insight that I think some of us are seas and some of us are cups,
Mm.
but I think it's actually really, really difficult to be at peace with being that small. Like for being at peace with being a cup and no more than that. And I think what I would want to end on is so much of the work of wisdom is learning, am I a sea or am I a cup? And what would it mean? What would it mean for how I experience things to be at peace with what I am? And to be at peace for what that means for how I know God, and to be at peace with how you know God. So that so much of what seems like contradiction or difference might not actually be contradiction, might not even really be difference per se, just at least not otherness. It's just you're a sea, I'm a cup. And that's salt water, this is fresh water. And, that's for swimming in and this is for drinking. And I think that story it's staying with me night and day. Right? That God, I want to be that little cup that I am, and I want to be at peace with being the cup that I am, and at peace with the sea that someone else is, and never confuse the two. So that's my prayer for myself and my daughter, and for anyone listening, like to know who you are, who the Lord has made you to be, kind of how you've been formed, and be at ease with that.
Yeah, it's good.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And Chris, how can people get more information if they want to find you anywhere? What's your website or
I would tell
Substack?
everyone to studiously avoid as much as
Okay.
they can. But yeah,
Okay.
it's called Speakeasy Theology. Part of the reason it's called Speakeasy Theology is, back in the day when you weren't supposed to be buying and selling liquor, you had speakeasies that didn't advertise themselves. You kind of had to hear it by word of mouth.
Ah,
And during the pandemic, I had this prompt to not put theology out in public unless it was at a place where people had to go and find it. Because I think one of the things that happens, there is a time for kind of speaking publicly, but if everybody's talking all the time in the same space, and you can't really hear anything.
true.
And I think there's a need, at least for me, in terms of the cup I am, to kind of say, I'm going to be over here doing this. And if you want to come over there, then you're welcome. I'd love to talk with you. But I don't want to. And that's how I ended up on Substack, and why it's called Speakeasy Theology. And I don't post on, I share art on Instagram, but I don't share theology on Facebook or on Twitter or TikTok or anything like that, because I don't think I'm supposed to be just out there being overheard for everyone. So, if people want to go out of their way, Speakeasy Theology is probably the place to go.
Cool.
Thanks, Chris. And I was just thinking what you just said in your last benediction, which it is, and we're leaving, but I'm like, okay, I might have to wait another year for part two, but that cracks open a whole other
Yeah.
conversation of just actually going, hey, God created me this way, God created this person this way. There's so much comparison, or they're having this mystical experience I don't, or they're feeling God this way. I appreciate you saying that, because from what I hear from that is looking at going, this is how God made me, and I don't need to compare myself with how God made somebody else. And so that's such a huge part of, I think that we create our own suffering when we're comparing ourselves with other people.
Yeah.
So thank you for, yeah, I love that. We need to, I love that you quoted a Sufi mystic too. Not, well, you at least told the story about a
Yes.
Sufi mystic, but thank you, Chris. You gave us
Yes,
a
thank
lot to
you.
think about, chew on. We really appreciate your time. Thanks for
It was
being with
lovely.
us today.
It was a good way to spend this hour. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris.
Happy
Talk to you.
birthday.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, we hope you enjoyed that. There's a lot of really great content coming. We were just talking about the guests we have lined up with content through January. So hang on for more. There's a lot more coming.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Thanks for being part of our community. We appreciate you.
See ya. Thank you for joining us on the Face to Face podcast. For more resources and information, please visit face2facenetwork.org.
And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a 5-star review. It helps others discover tools for deeper connection and lasting freedom. We will see you next time.